Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's BlazeMeter webinar, Understanding Load Test KPIs and Report Results. We are going to begin in about 1 minute. We'll allow people who are still arriving at this moment. While we're waiting, I just want to actually make a few preliminary announcements, and then we will turn things over to our presenter, Kieran Makarla. So firstly, this webinar is being recorded. I know that often people ask during the course of the webinar. It is being recorded, and everyone will receive a copy of the recording likely tomorrow, if not by Friday, in their email inbox. So keep an eye out for that. Secondly, our webinars are always best when there's audience participation, and what I mean by that is that we will leave some time, about 10 or 15 minutes, for questions at the end of today's webinar. You can ask questions via the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. As I always say, we do get a lot of questions and a lot of really great questions. However, in the interest of time and in the interest of the audience, if you can please try to keep them on topic of today's webinar, which is again on understanding load test KPIs and report results. For example, today's webinar won't be, unlike some of our other webinars, won't be focusing that much on Apache JMeter or on the open source automation framework called Taurus, but on more kind of a big picture load testing level of what are KPIs and how to analyze the reports. And the tool that we'll use today is BlazeMeter. So any topics, any questions on that topic would be very much welcome. I can't guarantee you we'll get to every single question in today's webinar, but we have them all in our system, in the webinar system. Please ask them, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Finally, at the end of today's webinar, there will be a 30-second survey that we encourage you to fill out for two reasons. Firstly, it allows us to gain your feedback of what you thought was great about the webinar and maybe ways that we can improve for future webinars, and we ask you to be as honest as possible. We really do appreciate your feedback, and we try to make them always look to improve. And secondly, it will give you the opportunity to request a follow-up one-on-one session, which you can expand upon today's webinar to talk anything about BlazeMeter, key features, and how we can help you meet your performance testing needs. So if you would like a demo, please request so in the survey. So with all that said, I'm now going to turn things over to our presenter, Kieran. Kieran, over to you.
Right. Thank you so much. Just a second while I share my screen. Can you see my screen, Jason?
Yes, the screen is already shared.
All right. Good morning, everyone, from here in sunny California. For others, good afternoon, good evening. I'm so happy that you could join me. So today's webinar is going to be on load testing and how you can measure the KPIs and the reports. About myself, I've been in this industry for the last 15 years, and I've been a lead engineer, functional architect, and product manager at Cisco and Hewlett-Packard. And I strongly believe in how teams perform testing, and primarily the continuous testing, and how it enables teams to deliver value to their customers or partners. I'm an evangelist here at CA BlazeMeter. With that said, here is the agenda. So today's topic are going to be on why and how you can do performance testing and what exactly performance testing means. And there are various types of performance tests which you can run, and we'll go over those. And once you run the test, what are the key KPIs you need to be looking for? We'll run a sample test scenario and how you can fine-tune this scenario to analyze your test. We will identify the bottlenecks that tests might produce. And as like anything else, when you try to test, you need to calibrate it so that you can find the fault lines in your test and in the systems that you're actually testing. We'll do a demo and followed by a Q&A question. Okay, with that said, let's jump into the bigger picture. As you mostly know that most of the businesses are evolving, and as part of that evolution, they are turning towards digital transformation. That means, you no longer need to have a physical storefront for people to experience your products or services. So most often times, you would be interacting with your customers and partners using your digital assets, such as your web page or mobile app. So that means your face is actually your app. But once you interact with your customers using those digital assets, now the engagement will be equivalent to the how your customers interact or experience you. And there was a study done by Google recently wherein they found out that 53% of users just abandon your site or stop interacting with you once these digital assets perform poorly. And in this case, almost like 53% drop off if your websites don't respond within a given time frame. And almost 30% of the users expect to be instantaneous. You might have seen that most often we are now engaging more frequently, like for the live telecasting, events, everything on the digital assets. And just imagine if there is a time lag from the event that just happened and what the users are viewing. So it's almost like an instant response is what they're expecting. But the worst thing is when your website or the asset which you would want to put in front of your customers and partners fails on a critical day. Just imagine if you are a retail industry trying to ramp up towards your most busiest season, could be like a Black Friday or could be a Singles Day or what have you, and your website starts performing. One, potentially you can have multi-million-dollar loss. That's one aspect of it. Worse yet, you might even lose some reputation. So that's the things which you would want to avoid when you try to go in front of your customers with your digital assets. Now, why do you need performance testing? First and foremost, you will need to identify the problems before your customers find it for you. So that's critical. It's doing yourself a favor by doing that. Another thing is, we should stop. First of all, other thing is, you should be able to you need to maintain that revenue loss, or you need to stop that revenue loss, and because of which you might also lose the credibility. So what are the things which you're looking for as part of this performance testing is, first, you're trying to find the response time, if it is acceptable and within the standards that the companies or the industry might have set. And it's not about just users trying to flock to your website or an app. It's about how good you're serving them. That's what we call as a throughput. How many requests are coming through and how many of them are you able to serve. So when do you actually do performance testing? And what are the scenarios under which you do performances? First and foremost, whenever make a major code change, and if you are making any infrastructure changes, you will want to do those tests. And frequently, companies do upgrade their softwares and hardwares, and that's the scenario where you will want to test this before you roll it out to production. And as we said, this is a must when you are planning to have a major effort in terms of, having a major event that's coming up, or a major type of event that you're hosting on your digital assets. And also when you open up your business to new lines of businesses, when you are opening a new digital front, or maybe you're opening up to a new segment of your customers. And that's when you want to make sure that the platform is capable of handling that kind of a traffic. So what exactly is your application performance test? What are you trying to do then? So primarily, you're trying to find the effectiveness and the speed at which you can test your application using the resources that this application uses. So you're trying to make sure that whether this particular system that is under stress is responsive enough or not. As you said, there are a couple of types of performance tests. So let's get to the bottom line and set, what those mean. So you might hear the term called load test. So this is how you generate demand on this particular application and try to find the response time. So you're trying to log in as many users as possible onto the system and trying to test the load of this application. Stress test is when you subject the same type of same application to an unusual high loads, which is beyond the normal pattern. And performance test is a combination of both load test and the stress test. Both the system you're subjecting it to a high number of users. At the same time, you're also using a high number of unusual type of activities on that particular application. Maybe you're downloading a file, uploading a file, posting a picture. These are the various activities that you're trying to do for that on that application. And soak test is a combination of both load and stress, that is performance, and doing it a prolonged time. So that way you're trying to identify at what point in time you are experiencing a performance degradation. It could be because of there was a memory leak. Could be because there was a CPU overusage, or there's some sort of a log files that are getting filled up, because of which you would start some sort of an IO activities happening in the background. And now you need to mark this test against the industry best practices. That's what we call as a benchmark testing. In this earlier study, there were 3 seconds response time is what primarily most of the retailers try to achieve. So those are the types of the standards against which you would compare your website. So now let's look at, now you have done this test. Now what is that you're trying to measure against? That's where you have this key performance indicators. First and foremost, you would want to see how many active users are logging in, or how many users do you need to prepare for, right? So this is what we call as the concurrent active users that are actually accessing the system. Hits per second is also called the throughput, wherein you would generate a request towards a target server that's hosting this application and on any given user action. Errors per second is also a rate at which the errors are generated while these activities are taking place. And the response time is the time it takes the system to accept the request, process it, and send the result back to the user. Latency is the time that it takes for the request to go and be back. And again, here the latency would always be subset of a response time. The reason behind that is most of the latency is done because of the network bandwidth on which your application, where the application is and from where the user is trying to connect from. And the connect time is the first time the user tries to make a contact with your application, usually during the login, and usually when they try to access your website for the first time. This could also include your SSL handshake. There are many other type of KPIs, but these are all the primary ones. Others prominently would be, the bytes or throughput. With that said, let's look at the sample test scenario. So maybe you have a flight application, which maybe an airline industry has. And this is the scenario in which, this is a classic business scenario wherein you would expect user to go to this website, search for the available airlines, flights, and be able to book it if you find one. That's preferable. And, if you are interested, you would also be able to pay for that. And once you're done with this transaction, you'll be logging out of this application. So this could be a simple business case scenario. But what you're trying to do is, trying to mix the scenario up so that it's a realistic way how people will interact with your application. So if you look at the bottom, you are actually creating a bucket of users who are trying to do certain type of activities for the same business scenario. So 20% of the users could be searching and booking a flight. So, these are all the guys who would want to make sure that, they get the flight and, they try to complete the transaction in the first go. But there are about 60% of the people who are just out there to search for the available flight without even booking it. And maybe 10% of the users could be already have an existing reservation, so they want to change it or make a seat change or what have you. Another 10% could be an agent who would be running a report to find out, how many transactions he has made for the day. So as you can see, there is a mix and match of type of users and the type of activities they were doing. And that kind of creates a good sense of how your users might interact with your system. So you can fine tune it depending on, if you have a sale, then the number of users flocking to your website could be even more, and the number of people who are purchasing the tickets could be even more. So those are the various types of mix of the scenarios which you would want to focus on, so that you're trying to gauge or ascertain what your users might be doing on your system. So let's look at, once if you have the scenario executed, what are the things which you need to look for? In this case, I'm showing you here a graph, and on which you have your users. In this case, they are ramping up over the period of time, time on the x-axis, and the response time here, you can see, is been consistent. That means even though the users are onboarding onto your system, the system happens to respond in a meaningful way without any spikes. So this is a classic case where everything is going fine, and you don't see any bottlenecks within your system. And this is another instance where you are experiencing some activity, in the sense there is a sensitivity to the load. That meaning the application is respond fine initially, but as and when there is a load, the number of active users increase, it's experiencing a spike in the response time. The more the response time, it is bad, because you would want the response time to be as minimal as possible and within the business acceptance. That is 3 seconds or 5 seconds, what have you, what your business might have set as an expectations. So in this case, as you can see on the right-hand side, as the users onboard, you're also seeing a spike in the response time. So is it a problem? They could be, because as in more and more users come in, your response time could be unacceptable. Which means you would want to take some action, so that your users will have a good user experience, like being able to perform the business transactions. In other instances, if this stays relatively high and doesn't peak beyond after a certain load, then it should be okay. And this is another example wherein you clearly have a problem. It's First of all, it's sensitive to the load. On top of it, you're also seeing errors creeping up in the backend. So that means something is going wrong, which you would want to address before the system becomes totally irresponsive, right? So those are the things what you would want to identify and capture before it's too late. So these tests are all fine, but calibrating these tests based on your specific need is important. A couple of things which you would want to take into consideration is the user activity. As you can see, not every user will be doing the same thing. So they might be doing various things on your website. Some could be booking a flight, others could be making some reservations, or could be changing some reservation pattern. So you need to get a good sense of what your scenario mix is. And ramp-up time is equally important, because you don't want to bombard your website with all the users at the same time and expect that that's what the performance testing is all about. So you need to manage enough ramp-up time such a way that you would gradually onboard your users onto your system. And same case with the ramp down time, because you're trying to kill the threads that are processing these users. And that means you're trying to detect memory leaks as and when this is happening, and also make sure that in case if the system becomes irresponsive, at some point in time it should be able to recover itself and be able to perform normally. So these are the things or fault lines you're actually trying to check using this ramp up and ramp down time. And think time is also equally important, because as you can see, all of these transactions could be doing different type of activities. One could be searching for a flight, which could be a fairly simple, but other could be like, entering some information about yourself, giving information about your credit card. Those kind of things take time. So you need to make sure that, these kind of activities are factored into your testing. So that way you're actually testing for the real scenario. The run length is also equally important, because certain times, depending on what you're testing. Usually, when you're trying to stream a live video, you would expect the user to stay on that particular event for a good 10, 15 minutes or what have you. The others, they might be there just to take a peek at the picture or maybe post something and they might wrap up. So depending on what type of industry you're serving and what type of event that is, you would want to factor in the run length, because that's what you're trying to identify as the real user experience. The end of all this, you are trying to identify a couple of key things. One, you would want to find out, what are your slow pages so that you can take a look at them and can work towards getting them fixed. Another is, what are the slow type of transactions happening? Is it because you're trying to find the available goods in the nearby warehouse, or is it availability of this particular item from your back office? So these are all the various types of transactions which might be fine-grained within a overall business scenario. So you would want to focus on these type of transactions to make sure that all of them doesn't affect the overall experience for your user. And the other classic case is where you would have a scenario wherein some of the sequels could be taking too long to complete. And most often, 80% of these can directly correlate to the performance of your website. So you want to take a look at those sequels which are performing poorly so that you can improve the overall experience for your users. So with that, let me quickly jump into a demo, and following that, I will take questions. Let me switch to my website. Okay, here you're looking at a BlazeMeter, and as you might say, BlazeMeter is an open source based SaaS solution which can performance test. And there are various things which you can do using our platform. And one thing is, on your top you have all the projects, and projects are the way where how you can organize your work, and you would be able to have your teams access that project and you can start working towards running some tests. So on my left, you have all the various tests that I ran recently. And these are all the various updates which I ran in the recent times. And on the bottom half is my usage report. So first and foremost, you would want to create a business scenario for you to test. So there are a couple of ways which you can do. One, you can use your JMeter to create a business scenario, or you can use our BlazeMeter plugin to do that for you. So in this case, I have access to Google Store to install a Chrome plugin, and the Chrome plugin looks like this, and wherein you can use it to capture your business scenario. The business scenario which I'm going to use is going to use a sample web application on Demo Blaze. Or there are two websites which we have. One is Demo Blaze, another is a Blaze demo. So no matter what type of application which you're using, you can use any of these websites. So another is Blaze demo. So this is a sample travel website wherein you have your departure city and the destination city. So as a user, first and foremost, you would want to record the transaction. So let's start recording this transaction. So this will capture all the HTTP requests. So in this case, I'm choosing a departure city as Boston, and my destination city is London. So I check for the various flights that are available. And then doing so, I would go and look for a particular flight, and if I a suitable flight, I choose this flight. And I provide some meaningful information like the first name, last name, and that will enable me to go and make a purchase of that flight. And this would complete the business transaction. So here I would come in and try to stop the recording. Now at this point, I have a couple of options. One, I would be able to see what are the various transactions or various types of requests that this particular business transaction had. And I can quickly see that here. As you can see, these are the various posts, and you can click on this to give complete details on what this business transaction is all about. And once I'm happy with that, now I would be able to download this particular JMX file. As you might have seen, like, JMX can be used. So you can use your JMeter, which is in IDE, and you would be able to use that JMX file to make some modifications, because some of the times, you would want to have a little bit of customization to your scripts. So that you can do using your JMeter. But for now, just use the script as it is, and using our Blaze meter, we can now be able to test create the test scenario and be able to run this at a scale. So here I can now use a create test section. So there are multiple types of tests which you can use, which you can create using our Blaze meter. The one which I'm going to focus here is on the JMeter test. So by clicking that, then now I have a test scenario page. And here I would be able to just upload the JMX file which I just created. I would go into my place where I just created that JMX file. And here I would be able to see all the various things which I can now be able to do. One is I would want to create a test failure criteria, which I would want to measure my KPIs against. So this will show up all the various available KPIs. And some of them are in the various things like in the response time, how quickly my website would be able to respond. So in this case, I would set the average response time to be less than, maybe 3,000 milliseconds. And I also have this option to stop the test if it is something which my business is so particular about, so that, I would know that, this needs to be fixed right away. And I can add few more KPIs, like in terms of, say, for example, if I'm trying to test for the latency, and if there are some error rate which I would want to check it for, then that's something. So the error percentage, I would want to make sure that this is, if this is greater than 5%, then I would want to make sure that, this needs to be fixed, because this is not acceptable. So some of the things I can just add more things like, the latency related one. So latency is maximum of, since the response time is a superset of the latency, so this definitely should be less than the number like 2000. So these are all the various criteria which I can set, and now I have defined it against my business scenario. Now the Blaze meter provides the various ways which you can test this business scenario. One, you can use the sandbox mode, which means it is more like you to test the correctness of the script which just got created. So for this, you wouldn't be using a Blaze meter test credits. We will be in this particular sandbox environment is shared between various users. So that way you're trying to make sure the script itself is correct. But as and when you find that the script is fine, then you would want to do the real performance test. That's where you can specify where you want to generate the load from. This is where you are hoping all your virtual users will be created. So you can pick and choose the region, and we support quite a few regions. In this case, we support Amazon, Google Cloud, Azure, and the various regions these cloud providers support. And this is the users are the virtual users, and you can specify close to 1 million or 2 million, what have you, depending on what your business case is. And what that does is it will create appropriate number of engines from which this load would be generated. In this case, I've set the user count as 20. These 20 users can be accommodated on a single engine, and that means 20 threads were going to be run. And as I was mentioning earlier, the ramp up time is really important. In this case, say for example, if I set 10,000 users, so each engine can generate 500 users. So 500 into 20 is 10,000. So that's how the engine kind of accommodate or spread the load against these engines. And you can also specify the ramp up time in seconds, because as I was mentioning earlier, you would want to make sure that the users onboard at a meaningful way so that it doesn't flood all the users at around the same time. And the duration of the test could be depending on what type of test you're running. Is it for a soak test? That means it could be for a couple of hours. If it's just to try to check for a certain aspect of a system, then you can set the test duration depending on what your business scenario is, right? So once you have identified all these various parameters, what you want to test for, that's when you give the test a name, in this case demo test, and you can save that test. And once you have the so the problem here is with the script itself. So let me upload another script. The name of the script was the problem more than the name. So let me delete this one and just upload a script like this one. So both the scripts are same. It's just the name is different. So in this case, so now once the test has been created, now all you're trying to, so there are various other things which you can do as part of your test creation. You also can factor in for the network or bandwidth. So in this case, you can specify where the users are coming in from and what they're going to be on, which network they are going to be there. So you can fine tune your or calibrate your tests so that you are actually testing for the real scenarios. So in this case, you can say most of my users are going to be a Wi-Fi. So based on that, the test is going to be calibrated accordingly. And what good a particular platform is if it cannot integrate with other DevOps tools. In this case, we integrate with various monitoring tools like Amazon CloudWatch, CA APM, Neuralink, Genetrace, and AppDynamics. So that way, you are able to create the real sense of how an application is performing in front of your customer, so that you can capture the real business user experience. And you can also specify how you would want to be notified upon a test is completed via your email, or I will show you a little later, where once the test is been run and completed, now you would also be able to share that results with your team. So in the essence of time, I ran a test ahead of time so that we can go over those reports. So at that point, you can run the test. So the one which I just created, this one. So since this test is not run, I can just kickstart the test and it will run. And while this test is running, let me show you a test that I created ahead of time and the reports that are associated to that. So the tests are where you will create all the tests, and reports are where the test results are being generated. So in this case, I've created a Blaze demo. In this case, I've created users around 1490 virtual users. And this test has been run from multiple locations. As you can see, some of the users are coming in from Frankfurt, few from East Coast, and few on the West Coast. And I also set the test duration to be around, close to an hour. Like it started at 11:30 and it completed at around 12:20. And this is how a test results would be generated and shown to the users. Let's go over this particular results. As you can see, there are two charts shown. On the left-hand side, you have a load chart, wherein you are seeing the number of gradual users that are being onboarded onto your system. And the peak users are around 1490. And as and when the users are onboarding, you can see that this is the hits or the throughput, right? Initially, to start off with, there are very few hits. And as and when the users are onboarding, your throughput is pretty high, meaning that most of the users are able to interact with your system fairly good. And as and when the users have reached the peak users, most of the throughput has been consistent, And there has been a few drop off here, but it's been fairly consistent. That's pretty good. But if you try to map the same things to the response time on your right hand side, the one thing which you need to be focusing is on this yellow line. So initially the response time is pretty high, meaning that it took too long for the users to get any response from the system. And that's the reason why the throughput is also pretty low here, because users are trying to do something and this website is not been response enough, and because of which the users are not able to get that throughput. Okay, and after a certain point in time, the response time has dropped off dramatically, and it stayed pretty good, like 15, like in 158 milliseconds. Most of the users are able to get some sort of a response back from the system. And remember, the threshold what we set was around 3000 milliseconds, and or 300 milliseconds, depending on whatever business scenario is. So that means your system is responding well enough within that specified time. So on the top, you would have all these KPIs identified, and the color code match that of the graph. So that's one advantage of Blaze Mirror, because it'll be able to show you all this information in a graph that is readable first and foremost, and also be able to give you a quick overview into all the KPIs that you are interested in. JMeter for that, for example, will not be able to do all of that, and also will not be able to do the test management at the same time, be able to correlate all the information from the various geographical locations. In this case, we ran this test from different geographies. So that's one of the strengths of the Blaze Mirror, in giving you all the KPIs that you're interested in a meaningful way, so that you will be able to understand how your tests are being conducted and how the results associated to those tests are can be read. So in this case, you have a maximum users of 1490, and the average throughput, meaning the average time it takes for this user to see a meaningful response, is around 1990. And there are fairly significantly less errors, and the average response time is 320. Remember, the response time which we set was for 300 milliseconds, so this is slightly more than that. So it depends on your business case. If you are strict in that 300 milliseconds, then naturally this test has failed. And you will also need to look at what percentage of people are experiencing this slowness. Is it around 90%? Then 90% of people are seeing it a little more than that 300 milliseconds threshold what you said. So definitely that's something which you would want to work on, because it's not a small section of people. It's almost like 90% of people are experiencing this response time. And this is the bandwidth which you are showing. You're saying that almost you have 1789 milli what do you call it, bits per second. So that means this is fairly good. There is no network latency that's causing this. So that's pretty good. If you look into the timeline report, it will be able to analyze and plot all the information on the various pages that are part of your business scenario. So as you can see, these are the various KPIs, the virtual users, the hits or the throughput, and the errors, and the response time and latency, bytes, and connect time and response code. So if you look at all these various KPIs, now you can go in and see how your virtual users are onboarded. And in this case, I've selected all the pages that are part of your business scenario. In this case, you can see, how your users are onboarding to a particular page. So let's select this as all and try to also see what's the throughput for that. So you can go to individual page and see how the users are being onboarded, and what are the throughput for that particular page. In this case, let's deselect the response time, so that way you would be able to correlate this. So you have your virtual users onboarding, and this is the response time. This is the average throughput. So the throughput has been pretty high, meaning most of the users, as and when the users are onboarded, the system is able to respond to them, and most of the requests that's generated are being addressed. So ideally, this is how the system should be, and as and when as the users are being dropped off or onboarded, or been getting off the system, naturally this throughput will be going down. And the same would be in the case of errors. In the case of errors, there are significantly less errors, so not much to be worried about. You could also want to see what's the response time is. In this case, you would want to check what's the average response time for this website. In this case, this is the graph you're looking at. And let's remove the errors and see how this particular graphs correlate. So as and when the users are onboarding, and you're looking at the average response time, which is red in color. So initially, it was pretty high, and as and when the users are onboarding, it kind of gradually dropped off, and the response time went back up. So this is place where you would want to keep an eye on, see what exactly is happening. So that's where you can try to focus on maybe something's wrong around this particular time. Look at the time stamp here. It says 11:30 to 48. So let's go back and see what exactly happened during 11:34. So you can use the time scale to pinpoint a particular section of time and see what has happened. And in this case, if we can see, the average response time is almost like, it's more than 3,000. And and as and when you slide this graph, this average response time has shrink down pretty drastically. So something has happened during this 11:31 to 11:34 time frame. So it gives you a time range where a problem has occurred. So that way you can pinpoint and kind of see what exactly is going on. And it also be able to filter the criteria. So the criteria is the KPIs which you set for yourself. In this case, if you are having a response time which is greater than a certain number, then naturally, that's the one which you would want to look for. And also the error percentage, which we set, like, if it's should be greater than 5%, then you mark it as a failure. So you would easily be able to identify the various KPIs. In this case, the reason why you're seeing all these the duplicates look like a duplicate, but it's not, because remember, our test has been run from multiple regions like Frankfurt, Virginia, and California. That's the reason why you're seeing these response time, the KPIs for that region. So you can filter those based on the region. So that way you can see if this is due to the way how the load is generated from a certain particular region. So that could be something to do with your network bandwidth or latency. So those are some of the things you can keep an eye on. So you can also drill down to the errors. For example, if you are experiencing some errors which are of 504, which could be a unresponsive system, or some gateway errors, or if it's a timeout. So you can pinpoint the errors to that particular time, and also try to make some assumption, or even pinpoint what exactly is happening during that time frame. And the response codes that you would want to keep a track on, and the assertion names which you may have configure, right? And you can also look into the logs that might have happened during that time frame, and you can get a complete view into your whole the test. So this is how you would analyze you would create a test and you would configure your KPIs depending on your business scenario. And you run your test and you would be able to measure those against the KPIs which you have configured. So with that, I will open it for Q&A. Jason?
Yes, thank you very much to Kieran for that presentation. Before we start the Q&A, I'll just remind people a few things. Firstly, you can still very much ask questions now. We have about 15 minutes. For the Q&A, the way you can ask questions, just to remind you, is in the questions tab on the webinar control panel. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but please try to keep them on the topic of today's webinar. We also have, by the way, he might chime in at a certain point. We have a Javier Cortevitarte, who's also one of our support engineers at BlazeMeter, who may answer some questions as well. He's on the line as well, so I wanted to just tell you that in advance. Okay, so let us get started. I will read some questions. Okay. Let me just see. We had somebody pointed out that one of the KPIs maybe that's also important. I think it might have been mentioned already, but is depending on the type of application, is transactions per second. I don't know if that's the same as throughput, what we said earlier, but let's just see. And somebody also pointed out that that sometimes in different load testing tools, the names of these KPIs can change slightly. I don't know if you wanted to address that, but I think that they're pretty much the same as a general rule.
Correct. So the KPI names are consistent for majority of them because industry wants to maintain some consistency around what we are measuring against. But again, it can depending on the type of vertical or businesses that the users are related to. So there could be a fine name changes around that, but most of the KPIs are consistent. Doesn't matter, what type of industry and what type of applications you are testing.
Okay, we had a question. Is it possible to calculate the maximum possible throughput of a system under test using BlazeMeter?
Javier, do you know the answer for that?
Javier, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, actually, that is difficult to calculate because also it basically depends on the target server or applications, what the target server application can withstand. So that's something that cannot actually be, calculated with precision. It probably could be a rough estimate, and then also it depends because most of the tests are executed are scenario dependent. It would also be depend on the amount of hits as well as, sorry, I mean to say the number of concurrency that you want to reach, and then it will basically also depend on the type of instances that are executing the scenario. So there are multiple factors that may not be able to allow you get that number precisely on your throughput or hits per second.
Okay. Somebody asks, what is the normal error rate that is acceptable?
So I would say that it depends on the business scenario, right? Sometimes, depending on, what's the criticality or severity of those errors, if the systems is totally non-responsive, and if that happens pretty often, then that's something which you would want to look into. Take a classic example where you're trying to add something to your cart. So most of the search related activities, that's that it's okay, if you're not able to search each and every element in the store. But as and when you are approaching where this customer is ready to now check out, that's where you would want to minimize errors, either because of processing a card or transaction or fulfilling that particular request, right? So that's depending on what the business scenario is, you would want to focus your efforts on those areas which really can hurt the user experience.
Okay. Can you please explain how to calibrate the number of engines and threads for the best results?
Right. For the blaze meter, we can spin up to 500 threads on a particular engine, that is 500 users. So that way, you're spreading the load against all these various engines. And preferably, that's the when we will have an optimal usage of resources. That because an engine is nothing but a particular agent that's running from a particular location. So given the constraints around the CPU, memory, storage, and the traffic that's being generated from that location, 500 is the maximum what we prefer. So that way, you can have a distributed load against all these engines. And that's when you would be able to test optimally. It's not that you cannot generate more load on those engines. Beyond a certain point, now you're entering into the area where it could the underlying resources that's hosting these generating this load could become a factor. That's where we want to stay away from getting that anomalies in the test results to keep it consistent.
Okay. Is it possible with BlazeMeter to check which HTTP request sent to the application? What was the response received for a failure transaction during the load test? Let's say can we get competent logs? I don't know if you want to show maybe the logs reports.
Yes, so as you can see, the error tab is where you're trying to capture all the various, these are the labels, because labels are nothing but the transaction names. And these are all the various code that were identified or generated in that particular page, right? And you can also have a response code associated to that. And if you can step back, and you also have an assertion name. So fairly comprehensive way where you can pinpoint the various types of errors that happen on a particular page or a business transaction. And you will also be able to see detailed logs per load engine. As I was saying, you can go to a system log, or you can go to a particular engine which is experiencing some distress. Then you can go in and see, is it because of the engine that's because of which you saw a spike in some errors, those kind of things.
Okay, and sticking with the errors as a question about that, can BlazeMeter filter errors like response codes 400, 500, which are shown by default in JMeter, and errors that can form response assertions?
Javier, do you know if we support filtering the response codes?
Actually, if you look into the errors report, and that's which you're actually displaying right now, the response codes are pretty standard for instances spinned up against a target server application. If there's most of them are generic, but there's also the information that you'll see in the errors report. It'll be basically the response that we get from that application, and that's what we display. If there's more details in regards to the description of that error code, then you can get the JTL file that is generated at the end of your test out of the logs file, and open up the JTL files JMeter locally, and if it doesn't, if the description is shorter than can be displayed in BlazeMeter, you can see the full request response, whether there's an error or is successful within JMeter locally.
I see. Yeah.
Okay, great. So a few more questions. Some about KPIs, some about BlazeMeter specifically. This one is in general, I think about KPIs. Which one would be better to measure, comparing the average response times or comparing the total response time?
So the average response time is like any statistics, right? What do you go with the absolute, or do you trying to find out the major um, majority of that, right? So average response time kind of try to divvy up, the best and the worst performance and kind of give you a, a meaningful way. But you can also try to filter out to see, what's the 90th percentile, what are the 90% of my users response time is, or is it 95%? So you can focus your efforts trying to make sure that 95% or 90% of your users experience is good enough. Maybe 10% may not be. So it depends on, where you would want to focus your effort. Usually average response time is to kind of give you a fair area. But if you are really interested in serving your customers and providing majority of them with a good experience, then I would recommend to focus on at least 95%. So that's the key sweet spot you would want to hit at.
Okay, a few questions about BlazeMeter itself. What is the maximum number of virtual users that BlazeMeter supports? Is it possible to have even more than 10,000 users?
Easily. The last time we supported is around 3 million. And as you can see, these type of tests, 3 million virtual users are something which we would want you to engage with us prior to your run, because we can try understand what your scenario is and what's the need. So that way you can make sure that those engines are ready for you to get going, and we would also be able to help you in calibrating your test so that you're testing for the right business scenario, not just for the sake of load. Right? Yes, BlazeMeter supports 3 million plus virtual users, not 10,000.
Okay. We also had somebody who was asking if it's possible, let's see, that he needs to show a report, as far as I understand the question, to show it in an audit interface. Can I do this with BlazeMeter? Not sure what he means by audit interface, but maybe you want to show about sharing a test report for a second.
Sharing a test report? Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay. So, thanks for bringing that up. So once a test is run, one of the key strengths of the BlazeMeter is ability to share these reports with executives and also the key stakeholders. Because remember, the reason why we are running these tests are making sure that your application conforms to the business acceptance. The one way which you can do is, once you run the report, in this case, Blaze demo, now you would be able to share this report. There are a couple of ways which you can share. One is you can have a URL which gets generated, and you can copy the URL and Slack it with the users who you want to share. So those users don't need to have a BlazeMeter account, so they can just be able to use this URL and be able to log in and just see the report results. They may not be able to make any changes to the test and what have you. And the other way is generating a summary report. So summary report is a high-level overview into your test. This is the same way you saw that there was this high-level headlights which shows the key performance indicators. Similarly, this is more like a PDF file which kind of gives you an impression, or gives an idea about what these KPIs look like, and what each of these pages are, and what's the times associated to that particular page, and any errors that you constantly see, and it gives you a graphical overview as well. This is something which you can share with your executives, and that's something which BlazeMeter supports as well.
Okay, we'll take one more question, then I'll go to some final steps. I know that we have a lot of questions that we're not going to get a chance to answer. As I mentioned, that it was possible, but we're running low on time. But we do have all the questions in our system, and we'll try to get to as many as we can to respond to individually via email. And we do thank you for asking these questions. But there was a question here I wanted to get to. Hold on. Can BlazeMeter filter KPIs on the one hand only during peak load, like peak load times, and compare them toward SLAs in general?
Yes. So if you look at the report, like let's go back to this report. And in the timely reporting, the where you can actually be able to see all the KPIs. In this case, say for example, if you are talking about the average response time, right? You can see that this particular graph is for all of the pages. But instead of all of the pages, you can go to a particular page that you are interested in and how the average response time for the home page looks like. So it gives you a clear idea about what's the response time for that home page. And similarly, you can also see what was the maximum response time for a purchase page. So that kind of gives you an idea that some during the purchase time, users are experiencing a pretty high response time, which may or may not be acceptable to the business. So that's how you can slice and dice the information what you get. And remember, this is at the peak load, so you're talking about close to 1,500 users, and that's what you can correlate with the response time for that particular page for that particular time. For example, if you are trying to look, 11:35 is when there is a peak load, and you can look at the response time for that particular page during the peak load and see how that's correlating.
Okay, that all sounds great. Thank you very much, Kieran. Okay, so we are running low on time. So Kieran, maybe you can just show that final slide.
Sure.
And just while we're waiting here, I just want to remind people a few things here. Firstly, for those who don't know, who don't have a BlazeMeter account already and would like to create one, you can create a free account at any time. It's not a trial. It obviously is limited in how many virtual users and how many tests you can run. But you can create a free account, BlazeMeter account, and start testing today. That's at www.blazemeter.com. We have a lot of the content that was presented in today's webinar, as well as a lot more content on open source load testing tools such as Apache JMeter, Gatling, Locust, and many others in our blog, www.blazemeter.com/blog. I think you'll find a lot of good information there. Also, I mentioned before that there's a short survey that's going to pop up right now. It just takes 30 seconds to fill out. We really do encourage you to fill it out. It'll give you a chance if you want to ask any further questions or to request a one-on-one demo or a demo with your team. But also it will allow you to give us your feedback on what you liked about the webinar and ways we can improve it as well. Thank you very much to everyone who came. Thank you to our presenter, Kieran Makarla, for a great presentation. Thank you also to Javier Cortavetarte for also answering a few of the questions. We have webinars about once every 2 weeks. We hope to keep you updated, and we hope you'll join us next time as well. And once final time, we did record this session, and you should be receiving it via your email either on Thursday or Friday. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day wherever you may be. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.